Hi, this is Julia Miller from EPA's State Climate and Energy Program. Thanks for joining us today for today's webinar on EPA's greenhouse gas data publication tool, including ways that state and local governments can use the tool. We're going to start with Brian Cook from EPA, who will give an overview of the tool, and then Marnie Stein from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources will talk about ways that they're using this data. Finally, we'll have Andrea Denny from EPA discuss how the state greenhouse gas inventory tool is incorporating data from the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So I'd like to thank Brian, Marnie, and Andrea for taking the time to be with us today. You'll see listed on the GoToWebinar toolbar and at the bottom of the agenda that's posted on the screen right now, a web link that you can use to find all the presentations for today's webinar as well as other background materials. Also, a recording and a transcript of this webinar will be posted at that site in a couple of weeks. We're doing our next State Technical Forum webinar on some work that we've done here at EPA to help states use energy efficiency and renewable energy to meet current and forthcoming rules and regulations for the power sector. And we'll send out a save the date in the next week or two. Our local climate and energy webcast series will resume this spring with a set of webinars on funding and financing greenhouse gas mitigation projects. We'll announce the dates and the details through our listserv and on our website. As always, if any of you have topics you'd like to suggest for future webinars related to energy, air quality, and climate change, you can email me at miller.julia@epa.gov, or you can submit your suggestions in the feedback form at the end of this webinar. Now I'm going to hand the webinar over to our facilitator, Catherine Morris from the Keystone Center, and she'll cover some of the logistics and get us started.
Thanks, Julia. We have a pretty large audience today. We have about 150 and counting. People are still joining. So I appreciate your patience working with the operator to get your audio access. I expect there are people that are still trying to get into the audio. So while we're waiting for them, let me just walk you through a couple of the opportunities you'll have to engage with our speakers today. You join the call as in a muted mode, so you can't actually speak, but we do want to encourage your questions and would like you to submit those by using the Q&A option on your control bar. You should see that automatically on your control bar. If you don't, you can go to View, and there will be an option to open that Q&A window up. So while our speakers are talking, please do enter your questions. Don't hold back till the end, and that'll give us a chance to review them, because what we'll do is stop at the end of each of our speakers and first take some of the clarifying questions that we receive and save the rest of the time at the end, as much time as we have, so that we can continue the Q&A and cover some of the more in-depth questions you have. We would like, we're not likely to get to all your questions. We never do, because there are a lot of people, and what we would like to do is have you follow up with our speakers. They've all been graciously agreed to provide their contact information with you, so that if you do have questions that you'd like to talk to them about directly, you can follow up via email. During this particular webinar, we're going to pause a couple of times and get your feedback on the greenhouse gas data tool that we're talking about today, based on what you're learning through this webinar, but also some of your past experience in actually using the tool. And we'll be able to share those results with you as we go through the questions. And we're also going to take a few minutes at the end, or hope you will stop and take a few minutes at the end, because when you close out the webinar, you're going to get a few more questions, only a couple, so it won't take too long, to ask some more about your needs and your potential use for the greenhouse gas tool. And that'll help inform EPA as they continue to work on this. As you see, everybody has a control panel which appears on the right-hand side. You can move it around, but you can also minimize that panel by simply clicking on the red arrow on that left tab and move it out of the way. And then as you want to enter your questions, you can open it back up again. And that'll help make sure that you can see the entire screen as our presenter going through their slides. So I think that about does it for the preliminary issues. I know we're getting messages that people are still trying to get online and get into the audio. But for those of you who joined early, I don't want to hold you up, and I know you have a limited amount of time, so we're going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Brian. Brian works in the EPA's Climate Change Division, and he's trained as an atmospheric scientist. And he's been spending most of his time on the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, which he's going to be talking about today. In fact, he actually helped develop the website that he'll walk you through, the greenhousegasdata.epa.gov website that showcases the data that is collected through the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So we're going to, first he's going to give you a basic introduction to it, and then he's actually going to take you to the website and navigate through that with you so that you can see how it works. So we're going to hand the presentation controls over to you, Brian.
Great. Can everyone see my screen with the introductory slide to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program and Publication Tool overview? I guess you're all
Not yet.
Catherine, you can see it.
Our panelists can, so I think you're good to go, Brian.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Thank you. Okay, so I'll start just by giving a little bit of background about the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program for those of you that might not be familiar with it. Starting in the year 2010, facilities for the first time that emit above 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent had to monitor and then report their greenhouse gas emissions to us. And the rule itself covers 41 different industry types, and the rule covers approximately 85 to 90% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And that coverage is achieved both by the reporting from direct emitters, downstream emitters, folks like refineries and power plants and landfills that directly emit greenhouse gases, and also suppliers of certain fossil fuels industrial gases. About 50% of the coverage that we have is from the direct emitters themselves, and the rest of the coverage that gets us up to 85 to 90 is from these fuel suppliers, like suppliers of petroleum products and natural gas and industrial gases. The first reporting deadline we had for the program came and went on September 30th, and that's when folks reported their 2010 greenhouse gas emissions to us, and 29 of the 41 industries reported at that time. And an additional 12 new source categories began collecting data in the year 2011, and they will report their 2011 emissions to us in 2012. And so a lot of you on the phone might be familiar with the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory and state greenhouse gas inventories. So we just put this slide together to kind of highlight some of the major differences between these two data sets that EPA provides. The U.S. greenhouse gas inventory is our comprehensive top-down assessment of national U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. It accounts for all sources of emissions within the United States as well as sinks of greenhouse gases. And to put that report together, we use national level statistics generally, like the amount of fuel, each type of fuel that's being combusted across the country, and internationally accepted methods to turn that activity data into estimates of emissions. The U.S. greenhouse gas inventory is a little different from the reporting program in that because it's focused nationally, we don't have any geographic or facility level data within the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory. So the reporting program is a nice complement in that it helps us break out the major sources of greenhouse gases across the country geographically. Also, the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory includes, because it includes all sources of greenhouse gas emissions, it does have some emissions coverage that the reporting program doesn't. For example, small industrial emitters are not covered by the greenhouse gas reporting program directly if they're below 25,000 metric tons of CO2, but those emissions are included in the national inventory along with emissions from the residential and commercial sectors. And the reporting program does kind of cover these emissions from those sectors through the upstream suppliers of fuels that are later consumed in the residential and commercial sector. But the one thing that the inventory has that the reporting program doesn't is emissions from the agriculture and land use change and forestry sectors. And we did just put out the first draft of the 1990 to 2010 greenhouse gas inventory on Monday, And now with the report program data out there for 2010, folks can kind of go and look at both data sets and compare them a little bit. And if you look at the numbers, you will notice that there are some differences in the total emissions from source categories between these two data sets, and there are good reasons for that. In a lot of cases, there's actually a different definition of the source category between the inventory and the reporting program. Also, as I noted, the reporting program has a 25,000 ton reporting threshold, whereas the inventory covers all sources. So for things like fossil fuel combustion, the inventory number is always going to be a little bit bigger than what's in the reporting program. There's also some sources that are lumped together in aggregate in the inventory, like emissions from from fossil fuel combustion in the industrial sector, that the reporting program breaks out a little more into industries like pulp and paper and hydrogen. But in the inventory, it's all just lumped together. Also, in the reporting program, facilities can use continuous emissions monitoring technologies. And in the cases where a facility might have both process emissions from industrial processes and also emissions from fuel combustion, we can't really break those emissions out into those two separate source categories. But in the inventory, these different sources are always broken out separately. And lastly, there are some sources of the inventory where we use default international factors to estimate emissions from different sources, and in some cases these international factors don't translate so well to the specific conditions at United States facilities, so there can be some differences there too, just because of the international factors that we're using in the inventory. This slide gives an overview of what we hope some of the uses of the greenhouse gas data that we published will be. The first is to enable industries to compare their emissions and to hopefully identify opportunities to reduce their emissions. And we found that just by making the data available and requiring facilities to go in and calculate their emissions, that it raises a lot of awareness about the issue, and hopefully folks can go in and compare their facility to other facilities of similar types, learn about best practices at more efficient plants and reduce their emissions that way. It also provides states and localities with greenhouse gas emissions data from facilities in their borders so that you could design smart policies or just learn about the major sources of emissions in your community to start thinking about what to do about the issue. We also hope that we can educate the public about the large sources of greenhouse gases, both in their backyards and also in aggregate across the country, learning about the types of facilities that emit the most greenhouse gases. And we're also providing the information to the financial community that can use it to inform green investment decisions. And also researchers have shown a lot of interest in this data for helping figure out where the major sources of greenhouse gases across the country are, what's happening to these pollutants once they get into the atmosphere, and other research projects. So in the greenhouse gas reporting program, we require reporting of several types of greenhouse gases. We cover CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and certain types of fluorinated gases like HFCs, TFCs, and SF6. The 29 source categories that reported to us this year are listed here. Some of the most notable ones are power plants and refineries and landfills. I'll also point out that we do have several of these supplier source categories, like suppliers of petroleum products, natural gas liquids, and industrial gases as well. And here's the list of the 12 source categories that will begin reporting in 2011 for the first time. These folks will be submitting their reports in September and will be publishing their 2011 data in January of 2013. The biggest sector here is petroleum and natural gas systems. Our subpart W has close to 3,000 reporters across the country. So in January, we launched this data publication tool, and we've listed out the URL here. And this is our public-facing data set that allows folks to go in there and learn about the major sources of greenhouse gases in their backyard. And we'll give a demo after I get through these slides, but tried to design it in such a way that users could quickly find the facilities in their state or their county or in specific industry types that they might be interested in. So we'll show you some of the ways that you can filter through the data in a minute here. This slide gives a summary of the 2010 data that we collected. And this pie chart shows the breakdown of emissions reported by stationary sources only. So this is roughly the 50% of total U.S. emissions that are reported essentially at the smokestack to us. And As no surprise, power plants is far and away the largest source of emissions from stationary sources in 2010, followed by refineries, chemicals manufacturing, other industrial facilities, and landfills. Some of the quick highlights about the 2010 data are that we received reports from over 6,700 entities across the country, and as I mentioned, power plants and refineries are the biggest sectors. Of the top 100 largest facilities across the country, those that emit about 7 million metric tons of CO2, 96 are power plants. There's also 2 iron and steel mills that are that large and 2 refineries. And the 2010 data accounts for roughly 80% of U.S. emissions, and we'll get up to that 85 to 90% threshold once the Track 2 sources, those reporting for in 2011, join the program. And this accounts for both the direct emitters and the suppliers of fossil fuels. So our timeline for next steps is we just published our 2010 data in January, and I think this week or last week we launched our EGRIT system, the Electronic Greenhouse Gas Reporting Tool, which is the system that facilities use to report their emissions to us. So we just launched that for facilities to begin entering their 2011 data. And the deadline for submitting their actual reports is April 2nd of this year. And between April and June, we will conduct our preliminary data verification. We have a system in place that looks for statistical anomalies in the data we're collecting. And when we find potential issues, we send messages to the facilities and ask them to resubmit their data. And over the period from April to June, we'll work with the facilities to make sure that the data they submitted is correct. And then we will publish the data that we've collected for the 2011 reporting year this summer. And again, I should note here that the only data we're collecting in April is just those facilities that reported to us last year, those same 29 industry types. And for the 12 new industry types that are joining the program this year, they will actually report their data in September. And then we will verify that new data that comes in between October and December of this year, leading toward a publication of the entire data set that we've collected for the year 2011 in January of 2013. And for additional information about the reporting program, you can go to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program's website listed here. And now I'll jump into the demonstration of the tool. And our tool that shows the data reported to EPA is available at ghgdata.epa.gov.
And before that, Brian, could we launch our poll questions to our participants? We just have one question at this point.
Sure.
For those of you, you should see on your screen, have you used the greenhouse gas data tool? Yes or no? Pretty simple. So if you could answer, and then we'll show the percentage of people, at least on our call today, that have used it in the past. Yeah, that was pretty quick. If we could see our responses, Rusty? Okay, so it does look like most of the people have not yet used the tool. So and about 24% have. Okay, Brian, why don't you go ahead then and walk 76% that have never used it before. Well, I'm sure we'll find this helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm glad we're reaching such a large community of new users then. So when you arrive at ghgdata.epa.gov, the first thing that you're presented with is this landing page with some important information about the data set. And one thing maybe I should mention before we get started is that this tool is optimized to work in browsers like Internet Explorer 8 and 9, and also Firefox and Google Chrome. So if you try to view it in Internet Explorer 7, what you would see on this screen here, if you had that, is a little Internet Explorer icon down below this section that asks you to install a free plugin, and it's not installing Google Chrome on your computer, but it's called a Google Chrome plugin that will optimize Internet Explorer 7 so that the tool functions better in that browser. So if you try to use it in IE, just download that free plugin, and the tool will run a lot more smoothly. But the most important information that we wanted to highlight for users is contained on this screen. The first bullet point here is that this data set does not reflect total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. It's only the 85 to 90% of emissions covered by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So we don't want folks to think that this is total U.S. emissions or the total emissions from a state and use it for state greenhouse gas inventories. There's other sources of emissions not covered here. Facilities covered by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program can always resubmit or amend their 2010 greenhouse gas report. As I mentioned, we went through an ongoing verification process where we would alert facilities of potential errors, they would resubmit their data, and then we republish the resubmitted data as it comes in. So over time, we have to update the publication tool to show the most recent data collected by the agency. Right now, all the data that's shown in here is current as of the most recent report submitted by a facility before February 10th. Another bullet here is that we wanted folks to be able to learn more about the data that's both in this data set and also in the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory. So if you click on this Learn More link, which I'll show you in a little while, it talks about the difference between these data sets and what's appropriate to use for each one for different types of analyses. And lastly, we've developed a help section that I'll show you real quick at the end of this as well. We have some tutorial videos in there to show people how to use the tool, and we also answer a lot of common questions that we've received from the public in there. So if you have any questions or want to contact us or want another video tutorial on how to use the tool, you can just go to our help section. Now there's three major ways that when we were doing our stakeholder outreach, we found that people want to kind of cut through this data. First, people want to look at all the facilities on a map. So if you want to just jump into a national level map, you can click here and all the facilities pop up. Also, a lot of people want to zoom into just their state. So we have a drop-down menu with all the states here. And if you want to just jump to a map of all the facilities in your state, you can select it here. Or if you're interested in just a specific facility that might be in your neighborhood, or you want to search for a specific town, you can type the name of the facility or the location in the search bar. To start the demo today, we'll start with the national map. And the first thing you see when you click on the map is all these circles with numbers on them. And these numbers represent the number of facilities in a general location. So it's not the number of facilities in a state. Like sometimes the circles make it look like this, 34 is on Nevada, and people thought that meant there's 34 in Nevada, but it's just there's 34 in that general region. It doesn't really tie to state borders. But as you zoom in on the map, you'll notice that these clusters of facilities start to break out into smaller groupings. And eventually, when you get down far enough, individual facilities start to pop out. And those are identified with this factory icon. And you can hover over any of the facilities on the map to learn a little bit about them. So we have the name of the facility here along with its address and its total greenhouse gas emissions. And if we continue to zoom in toward Washington, D.C., you can find facilities like the Capital Power Plant out here. And if you click on the facility, you can learn a little bit more about it as well, in addition to what we had in that hover tip. So we break out the total greenhouse gas emissions by greenhouse gas type, so that we have the emissions of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide listed here. And we also break out the emissions by process of the facility. Now this one's just emitting greenhouse gases from stationary combustion of fossil fuels, but for more complex facilities like refineries, we might show emissions from different sources like stationary combustion versus process emissions from refining versus process emissions from hydrogen production or petrochemical production or other things that are going on at that facility. And then we also display some additional information about the facility, like the type of fuel that it's burning, the measurement method that they use to calculate and report their emissions to us, and some other information like the number of units they might have. And these detailed data elements vary based on the type of industry that a facility that you've clicked on is in. And we also, at the top for each facility, have its FRS identification number, and this is a cross-EPA identification number that you can use to identify this facility in other EPA data sets like the Toxics Release Inventory or the National Emissions Inventory of Criteria Pollutants. And we also have its NAICS code, so this is just an industry classification code to let you know what type of facility it is. Now going back to the national map, there's several other pieces of information around the border of the map that I want to highlight. The first is the data dashboard at the bottom of the screen. So down here we broke all of the facilities that we collected information from into these 9 industry types, like power plants, refineries, landfills, and government and commercial facilities. And underneath the name of each of these 9 industries, we display both the total emissions from all facilities in that sector, as well as the number of facilities that reported emissions from that grouping. And you can use this tool to filter the data set to show just facilities in a particular industry you might be interested in. For example, if you just wanted to show all the government and commercial facilities across the country, you can click Deselect All, check the box for government and commercial, click Apply, and then notice that the map will update and now show just the location of facilities in the government and commercial sector. We've also got this list on the left-hand side here that shows the names of all the facilities that meet your current search query. So when we first landed at the page, all 6,180 facilities were listed here, but now that we've filtered for just government and commercial, we just have the name of the 173 facilities that meet that definition. And you can click on the names of any of these facilities here, and it will take you back to the facilities profile page that I showed earlier. We also have an emissions filter. So if folks are interested in focusing in on just the really large facilities across the country or the smaller ones that report their greenhouse gas emissions to us, you can update this filter. So if you want to see the location of the top 100 emitters, we can just reset the filter to show facilities between 7 million and 23 million metric tons. Click Apply, and the map will update to show just these 100 large facilities that are above 7 million tons. The last filter that we have is a greenhouse gas filter, and you can use this filter in the upper left-hand corner to search for just facilities that are emitting a particular greenhouse gas you're interested in. If you want to see just the facilities emitting HFC 23, you can deselect all the other gases, click Apply, and the 5 facilities across the country that emit this particular compound then pop up. I also have some analytical tools that we've developed to help users kind of sort through the data at a more national level. If you look up here, we've got a bar chart, a pie chart, and a data tree, or a tree map that kind of show aggregated data. If you click on the bar chart, we show both the breakdown of emissions by industry type or sector. We also have a bar chart that shows emissions broken down geographically. So this bar chart shows the emissions reported to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program from stationary sources by each state. And these state bar charts are broken down. It's a stacked bar chart that shows the emissions by sector within that state. So you can see how the emissions profiles of some states can be very different from one another. Most of them, the majority of emissions come from power plants, but for some states like Louisiana, there's a really large percentage of their emissions that come from refineries and chemicals manufacturing. And that's very different from states like West Virginia, for example, where almost all of the emissions come from power plants. We also have pie charts that show a breakdown of emissions by sector as well. And the cool thing about these pie charts is that you can kind of drill into them a little bit. Like if you were interested in exploring this refineries data a little bit more, you can just click on the section of the pie chart that's for refineries, and what will pop up is a new pie chart showing the percentage of emissions from refineries that are within each state. So you can see that most of the refineries are in Texas, Louisiana, and California. And if you click on, say, California, then you can see a breakdown of the emissions by the individual facilities themselves and what contribution each refinery has to the total emissions from the state of California. And then again, you can click on one of the wedges for a specific refinery, and it'll take you back to this facility profile page. We've also got these data trees too, and this is just another way of visualizing the data. It's similar to a pie chart, but the total contribution of each facility to the total is represented by a square instead of a slice of the pie for folks that might like to visualize the data that way instead. And there's a couple other things that we have up here in the upper right-hand corner. We wanted to make it very easy to share this data through things like Facebook and Twitter to help get the word out, other social media sites. So any view that you can create, you can share in a blog or through social media. So if you wanted to create like a map of all the facilities in New Mexico, you could just generate this map, and then you can go up here and click share, and you can share this direct view on Facebook with maybe if you had some friends in the state of New Mexico and wanted them to just see this portion of the data set, you can share that with them quickly. Let's see. So the other things we have up here are also a link to our other data sources, and this is one of the things I mentioned up front, is our page that contains information about the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory, this tool I've been showing that shows the location and greenhouse gas emissions from large emitters, and then also the emissions reported by suppliers of fossil fuels. And there's a lot of municipal and local governments that have natural gas distribution companies, so maybe I'll highlight that real quick. You can go into the suppliers version of the tool, which is similar in lots of ways, and it has a map and a total GHG quantity for each facility, and you can find the total GHG quantity reported by each natural gas distribution company. So if you were trying to put together a more complete state greenhouse gas inventory, in addition to including the direct emissions reported in the other side of the tool, you can also go in here, find the local distribution companies in your state, and add up their emissions to include the residential and commercial sectors in your state's total. In the help content, which is also up here in the upper right, I mentioned we have a training video that you can watch. And we also have an FAQ section. There's a lot of information, background information in here about the greenhouse gas reporting program generally. What's the difference between direct emitters and suppliers? What is EPA trying to do with this data? A lot of those questions are answered here. And then we also have a contact us button as well. So if you have any questions about the greenhouse gas reporting program or this data, feel free to send us a question via email. You can just come into Contact Us, click here, and send your questions into our help desk. And the last thing I'll show is we have a site where folks can go and download the data. So if you're a heavier user and instead of run on the map, you want to actually download all the emissions data, we have a summary spreadsheet available that shows all the facilities that reported greenhouse gas emissions to us, and it breaks down their emissions both by greenhouse gas and also by sector. So you can open this up and find all the facilities in your state or your county or your city, see what their location is, their total emission, then how much of it's CO2 versus methane versus nitrous oxide, how much comes from stationary combustion versus other processes that might be going on at that facility. So we have that available for download with a lot of the summary data collected by the program. And then we also have more granular data available in XML format. And this data set includes things like the methods used by the facilities to calculate their emissions and other more granular data that the public generally isn't as interested in, but if you want to do some really thorough, deep analyses, you can dig in there and find all of the non-confidential data that was collected by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So that does it for my demonstration of the tool today. And I think did we have another question at this point for the audience?
Yeah, we had a couple. Just in terms of you just mentioned that you could download the Excel files. Can you also download some of the charts that you create through the filters?
Yeah, right now we don't have an ability to do that, but we are trying to add that in the future so that any chart that folks can make, we want them to be able to download like an image file so they can put it in a PowerPoint or throw it in a Word document or throw it up on a blog or something. So that's coming soon.
Okay. Another quick question. If you noticed an error in the data, how do you go about submitting a correction to EPA?
Well, if the facility itself found an error in their report, then they can resubmit it through our electronic greenhouse gas reporting tool. That's the official way that the data is going to get updated. But if anyone in the public notices things like a facility that they think should have reported that didn't, or if you see a facility's emissions numbers and it doesn't make sense, you can contact us through the help desk, and we'll look into those inquiries.
Thanks. One other question I bet is on the mind of a couple of the participants is whether or not there has been any information collected about how long and at what cost it is to the reporting entities to actually complete this information, collect the data and complete the information.
Yeah, but in the initial phases of the rule development, we did a regulatory impact analysis, and a lot of that information was compiled at that time. And we tried to develop the electronic reporting tool in kind of like a TurboTax model, where we walk the user through all the data that they need to submit to try to ease the reporting burden. And generally, we've heard from industry that they like the tool and are happy with the way we've developed it.
And just one more. You didn't mention anything about airline industry and being included in this. I assume it's not. Are there any plans to include them? And are there any existing reports or tools that are absolutely comprehensive, and that is include all greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, well, the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory does include all greenhouse gas emissions, and for airlines in particular, we don't require reporting of individual airline companies, like the total quantity of fuel that they burned, but we do have coverage for that sector through the suppliers of petroleum products. So every refinery reports to us how much jet fuel that they made, and they don't keep track of where it goes or where exactly across the country or across the world the emissions occur, but we do know how much jet fuel is being supplied into the U.S. economy and can figure out how much greenhouse gas emissions are associated with that way.
Okay, let me just sneak in one more, and while we do that, if we could launch our second question for our participants. One of the last questions that we just got was whether or not EPA actually has any method for verifying the data that's submitted.
Yeah, we do have a verification process, and between September and January when we released the data, we were working with all the facilities to get them to resubmit their reports where we found errors. But we have a couple ways that works. First, in the electronic greenhouse gas reporting tool itself, we have reasonable ranges built into the tool. So if someone enters a number that's outside of a reasonable or expected range, they get an error message right away prompting them that hey, you might have used the wrong units to enter this value, or you might have added an extra zero by accident or what have you. So we try to do a lot of those initial checks up front before the data even comes to us. But then on the back end, we have additional validation checks that we've developed that we run on the data once it's been submitted. And we also have checks that look at the data submitted by similar facilities to make sure that everything that's coming in from a particular industry type is consistent from facility to facility. And if we do find things that we think are substantive errors, then we have a process in place by which we send error messages to the facilities, and they have up to 45 days to either resubmit their data and correct the mistake, or to explain to us why they feel the data they submitted is correct. And I think of the 7,000 reports we received, we sent out requests for resubmission to roughly 2,000 of those 7,000 facilities. So a lot of time and effort did go into the verification process. And we've compared the data that we have in this tool to the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory and other publicly available data sets, and we do feel that it lines up fairly well.
Well, as you can see, the results of the question about the level of detail indicate that a lot of people still need to use the tool to be able to answer that question, and the next majority of them feel that you've about hit the mark. Is there one? Let me go ahead and ask this last couple of questions that are coming in. Is there a penalty for facilities that do not submit the data?
Well, all facilities are required to report per the Clean Air Act. This reporting program builds on the Clean Air Act. And we are still compiling lists of facilities that we think may not have reported and following up with them as appropriate.
Well, thanks very much, Brian. The questions are continuing to come in, and I hope we're going to be able to get back to those. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce our second speaker, Marnie Stein. She is the lead staff for the greenhouse gas emissions for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and Air Quality Bureau, and she's responsible for Iowa's annual greenhouse gas inventory. She coordinates the DNR's efforts to implement the federal greenhouse gas rules, such as the tailoring rule and the upcoming new source performance standards. And she's also staffed the Iowa Climate Change Advisory Council as they're developing the state action plan, the climate action plan. We've asked Marnie to join us because she has already used the tool in a couple of different ways, and we wanted her to share her experience about how she's found it useful and how they've used the information. So Marnie, we'll turn so you have your presentation up. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
You can indeed.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank EPA and Keystone for asking me to present on the webinar. They've always been very helpful throughout the process as we developed our greenhouse gas inventory, and we're also participating in the IPT process to develop the data downloads from the tool. So thank you very much for that. Okay, before I get started on how we're using the data, I wanted to give you a bit of background on Iowa facilities. We kind of have a unique blend of emissions in Iowa. We're a heavy agricultural state, and for our industrial emissions, of the 29 subcategories that reported under the federal program for last year, we only have categories in these 11 subcategories. We had 135 facilities total that reported, and these subcategories that are listed in red, those categories only had between 1 and 3 facilities per category. So, for instance, we have 3 ammonia manufacturers and 2 cement producers, 2 nitric acid producers, 1 lime producer. So that kind of makes our blend of industrial emissions interesting. So this is the breakdown of the emissions that were reported in the federal program, and then this data is from the data tool that Brian just showed you. And our percentages are very similar to the national percentages, with a few exceptions. We have no petroleum refineries in Iowa, and our industrial category is about 19.4%, which is higher than the national percentage of 4.9%, and that is because we have 40 plus ethanol plants and a lot of meat processing and food processing plants that fall into this other industrial category. And they tend to use significant amounts of fossil fuels, usually natural gas. And that other industrial category is broken down to about 61% of it is from food processors and 34% is from ethanol plants. Our power plant emissions are very similar to the national average, or the national percentage, which was 72%. And I should add, all the data I'm showing is from the previous version of the tool. It's from data that was received as of December 16th. EPA did update the data last week, and I didn't have time to update my slides. So what could the Department of Natural Resources use the data for? So the first thing is it allows us to compare our emissions to other places. So to the nation, to other states, and to other states in our region. This is fairly easy because the data is provided in a compatible format to what we already have. It's easy to download. The charts are very handy. And since we participated in this EPA ECOS integrated project team to develop kind of the formatting that ensured that it's in a format that we can use easily, and we're very grateful to have participated in that process and continue to participate in that. And we also received Network Exchange grant to develop kind of a database to download the XML data file into. The next thing we use it for is we get a lot of public information requests from media, consultants, industry about greenhouse gas emissions, and we can easily just refer them to the database. So that's very handy. Also, we have a statutory requirement in Iowa law that requires us to have a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program, and this fills that requirement. So we had a mandatory program for 3 years, and when EPA developed their federal program, we were able to go back to the legislature, and they changed the law to say that we could use the EPA data. So we are able to get all of the same data that we were collecting, but not use our resources to get it. And we get the data from EPA, and our facilities don't have to do duplicative reporting. So that was a benefit for us. So then we switched our focus, which I'll talk about later, to a full statewide top-down inventory. We are also using the data. We received a grant from EPA to use the emissions submitted to the program, the federal program, to identify high emitters of greenhouse gases. And then we market pollution prevention interns to those facilities. And those are college interns that work during the summer to help identify efficiencies that facilities can take in energy and water and other things. And then they calculate how much greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants are saved from that. And the things that they recommend are often actually implemented by the company. Okay, another benefit of the program is we previously did not have any landfill methane emissions. We didn't really have any data from that source category, and now we do, and those emissions could be used to identify future landfill gas energy projects, which is a benefit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state. We also could use it for greenhouse gas permitting and NSPS applicability determinations. And this is a little bit tricky because the data that's collected is actual emissions, so it's greenhouse gas emissions that were actually emitted during the year, and permitting thresholds are what could potentially be emitted if the facility was working at maximum capacity all year. But, for instance, the general rule, the threshold is 100,000 tons per year, and we had several facilities that we didn't know about that showed actual emissions greater than 100,000. So if their actuals are 100,000, that means their potentials are more than 100,000. So that was helpful. And then we're not sure, but all the information about the power plants may be helpful when the NSPS for new power plants and the emission guidelines for existing power plants are being developed later this year. And then the last one that we use the data for, and this is the most important one for us, is our statewide greenhouse gas inventory. As I mentioned earlier, we have a statutory requirement to do that, and it has to be completed by December 31st for the previous year, which for those of you that do greenhouse gas inventories or criteria inventories, that's a pretty short turnaround time. So as Brian mentioned before, there's kind of two types of greenhouse gas inventory. There's what's called a bottom-up inventory, and that's what this EPA greenhouse gas data is. So it's emissions that were reported at the facility level, in some cases at the unit level, and it's generally more accurate than top-down inventories where you just take total emissions from a sector at the statewide level or even the national level, and then you aggregate it down to the state level. And what we have is, since we had a mandatory reporting program, we have 3 years of bottom-up data from our facilities, and those were all of our major sources and ethanol plants reported under that program. And those are the same people that are reporting under the federal greenhouse gas program. So we can take the data from the data mart and easily compare it to the 3 years we already have, use it to show trends in emissions and how effective any mitigation measures or rules have been. The other kind of inventory we have is a top-down inventory. They were completed using EPA's state inventory tool for 1990, 2000, 2005, and then we just did 2010. And many of you from the state might be familiar with the 2005 one. It was completed by the Center for Climate Strategies while we were developing our climate action plan. And I think there's 30-plus states that have those. So this year we were able to use our resources to update that and do a 2010 inventory. It has more categories than the previous one. It includes agriculture and transportation and solid waste. And it's sector-wide emissions. It's not individual emissions like the EPA data mart data is. And it's kind of difficult to do because we just have 12 months to do it. And many of the data sources that you use are released 6 months to 3 years after our report is due. So for instance, I think the eGrid data is currently published for 2007. The EIA full data set is currently for 2009 and won't be updated until July. And we have to have 2011 emissions done by December of this year. So what we can do with the data from the data mart is make our bottom-up inventory more accurate and more timely by supplementing it with data from the data mart. So, and we did this last year, is we took the industrial emissions, for instance, for cement manufacturing, ammonia, nitric acid, lime, that we calculated statewide using the SIT tool, and we replaced it with the data reported to EPA by those actual facilities. And that's more accurate than just doing a statewide total. For instance, for nitric acid, when you do a bottom-up inventory, you take the total nitric acid produced in Iowa in the year, and you apply an emission factor. And when you do the data mart data, the mandatory reporting rule requires that that emission factor be site-specific and be developed from stack test data at that plant. So it's specific to that facility. So that is more accurate data, and we were able just to replace the more accurate data from EPA with the general data we were using. And then we're also interested in investigating how we could use the stationary combustion and electricity generation data. And that's very important to us since the EIA data is not as timely as we need it to be. What we did last year was we used 2009 data and then projected it for 2010. And now from this program from EPA, we actually have 2010 data from our electric power plants. That is it for my presentation. Here's my contact information. If you go to the iowacleanair.com website and click on greenhouse gas emissions, we have a pretty well-developed greenhouse gas page with all 4 of our inventories. We have information about the data mart and mandatory reporting and how to calculate emissions as well. So I guess, are we doing questions now or at the end?
Well, if we could, I think Andrea had a couple of slides that she wanted to show, and then we have a poll question, and we'll go to your questions that are coming in.
Okay.
So it will hand it back to EPA. You mentioned in your presentation the state inventory tool, and I think Andrea is going to talk a little bit more about that. Here you go.
Thanks, Catherine. I just very quickly wanted to run through 2 slides to kind of build on a few of the things that Marnie mentioned. So my name's Andrea Denny. I'm with EPA State and Local Climate and Energy Program, and I manage the state greenhouse gas inventory tool that Marnie talked about using. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we're integrating data from the reporting program into the state inventory tool, for those of you that are familiar with the tool. A little bit of background for those of you that aren't familiar with the tool. This is an Excel-based tool that we developed for states to make it easier for them to do a statewide top-down greenhouse gas inventory. It's modeled very closely after the national greenhouse gas inventory, so we use the same methods and sources. We adapted a little bit to accommodate for some places where data is not available at the state level, and then we also provide a separate standalone portion of it on electricity consumption at the state level, which is done differently than the way the national inventory is done. The idea is really to just make state inventories more consistent, more streamlined, a little easier to do, easier to compare across them because they're using standard methods. We do provide a lot of default data from sources like the Energy Information Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, et cetera. It's free of charge. It's really targeted towards state users, but we do make it available to other people who ask for it. And right now there's a framework to do an emissions inventory out through 2020, but we only provide data through 2009 because, as Marnie mentioned, there's a pretty big lag in some of those national data sets. So what's interesting, though, is now that we have this 2010 data, as we start thinking about doing updates to the tool to enable people to do 2010 inventories, we wanted to see what the potential is to integrate this new data set that's available into the tool. So basically right now it's pretty limited. We have a placeholder spot where you can manually put in the sources that are considered all in, which is that they pretty much 100% of facilities in that category are reporting under the reporting program. And that starts with 2010 data, so even if you put that in the current model, it would be the only data point you had for 2010 unless you went and manually entered data in all of the other modules as well. And we couldn't build that data in as default yet because when we did this version of the tool, the data wasn't publicly available yet, but we are exploring the option to automate that system so that you wouldn't have to go and look up all of those sources and type them in. It would be built into the tool. We're also looking at other modules of the tool to see if there are places where we could look at the data that's being reported and enhance or supplement some sources that, even though they're not all in, we just really don't have a lot of default data, and we're looking at whether it might be better to have partial emissions for that sector versus nothing at all. We're very, very interested in hearing from people who are using the tool, who are doing state inventories, on what you think would be helpful or where you've struggled to get data, where it might be better to have that partial data in there. Please feel free to contact me. My email address is up there. And then I'm just going to flip very quickly to the next slide to just show you what I was talking about. This is just an example of the input screen for the mandatory reporting rule data program for Pennsylvania, just because that's where I grew up. But basically, you'll see the sources that are listed there that are considered to be all in. Several of those sources we just didn't even have any default data for, like nitric acid and adipic acid. We didn't have state-level data on that, and now we do from the reporting program, so that's definitely an improvement. Some of the other sources we only had partial data, or we had confidential business data issues, so we were able to estimate based on production capacities, which are not considered confidential, but we were never really sure how accurate that data was. So what's in there moving forward will be an improvement, but as I said, we really are looking for ideas of other ways to incorporate this data. We're looking into it, but we know you guys have a lot of expertise as well. So just wanted to put that out there that we'd be happy to take your input.
Thank you, Andrea. And why don't we use that as an opportunity to launch our third and final question, because it goes to the question about EPA's role. Should EPA write reports based on their analysis, or is this better left to outside parties? And you have three options. So we'll give you a few seconds to answer that and then display the responses. Okay, why don't we see what everybody has to say. Takes a second for the results to come up. There you go. So the majority of the participants think it would be good for a combination of groups to do the analysis, and about much fewer, but about 17% think that EPA should conduct its own analyses and report. So that'll be feedback to EPA, and as I said earlier, we'll have a few more questions when you close out the webinar. So please do answer those. Those go to some similar questions about the use of the greenhouse gas tool. We have a number of questions for Marnie, and also a number that continue to come in for Brian. So if I could, let's see, start with one of the questions. Actually goes back to. Let me ask Marnie, and when you talked about, Marnie, of the comparison that you did between the 2007 through 2009 data that you had already collected and then the 2010 data that you put into your inventory and had a chance to look at that and see some trends, can you just highlight some of the trends that you did see in the greenhouse gas emissions? And you said you actually were looking for some indications about whether or not mitigation strategies were working.
Sure. Our emissions, and this is, we haven't done the full analysis on the individual facility data, but it did increase from the previous year, and our total statewide emissions have increased 11% over the past 5 years. And I guess for us, we will be using it in the future to measure progress of mitigation measures. We do have a climate action plan. However, most of that plan has not been implemented. So that would probably be a future use. And our industrial emissions increased. They were about 4.2 million metric tons in 2009, and in 2010 they were 4.6. So that's about an increase of 400,000 tons.
In your presentation, you also talked about the difference between top-down and bottom-up inventories and data collection, and I'm wondering if one of our participants wanted you to explain that a little bit more. If you could explain the distinction between those two approaches.
Sure. So for bottom-up inventory, say for industrial natural gas use, you would do what EPA has done and collect the amount of natural gas combusted by each individual facility and the resulting emissions. Whereas in a top-down inventory, you would take data from the Energy Information Administration, where they just have the total amount of natural gas and emissions from all industrial facilities in the state was this number. Whereas, and that's top down, but bottom up, you would have the individual number for each member of that category.
Thanks, that was helpful. I have some questions to go back to Brian, but before we do that, I don't know, Julia and Andrea, did you have any other questions you wanted Marnie to cover?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Well, there's a number of very specific questions about the inventory, the data, so and the tool, Brian. So I wonder if you could answer a couple of them. I'll throw a couple at you at a time. One was, are agricultural fertilizers and methane emissions going to be included in the reporting emissions? And how is this, if at all, going to affect the timeliness of the eGrid data, since you're able to get your data out much more quickly?
Well, on the agriculture side, none of the 41 industry types that are covered by the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program require reporting of emissions from agriculture. We did have one industry type for emissions from manure management facilities, but we're not allowed to collect data from that industry due to a congressional mandate. So I don't think that in the future we're going to ever have any emissions from the ag sector, but we do cover those emissions in the U.S. federal greenhouse gas inventory, at least at a national level. And I'm actually not too familiar with the eGrid system, so I don't think that I don't think they're planning to include any data from the greenhouse gas reporting program. So I don't think it would affect the timeliness of data coming out with that.
Sorry, if I could just supplement that. eGrid uses some of the same data that's reported to the reporting program, but they also use some additional data sets that are reported, I believe, to the Department of Energy. And so the data that's in the reporting rule alone wouldn't be enough to recreate the data that's in eGrid. And so, unfortunately, there is likely to still be some delay there, but EPA is kind of looking at that and how we're going to move forward with eGrid in the future.
Thanks for that. I'm going to throw up a few acronyms at you, Brian. One question is that suggested that the interface that you've developed is much more user-friendly than those that have been developed for TRI or CAP. And I wondered if there was any thoughts of trying to integrate those two into the same interface.
You know what? When we were developing the tool, we did a lot of outreach, and we talked with folks in like the TRI program, which is for toxic release inventory. And we kind of talked with them about some of the tools they have. And they have some similar features, like they have mapping tools where you can see all the facilities and what their emissions are. And there's other EPA data sets that are trying to, at a broader level, integrate data from various programs. Like there's something called the GEO platform that EPA is putting together that's going to integrate information from, say, the toxic release inventory, the GHG data, other EPA data sets, so that you can visualize individual facilities across the country and then see what their emissions are of all these different pollutant types all in one place. And I think that's a relatively new project across EPA that's getting started, but I think that's probably where the agency is trying to go, is to make this data more user-friendly across all EPA data sets.
Great. Another question comes about how the data is aggregated and whether it includes, you talked about how it can be summarized by town and county. Can you also map it according to FIPS census numbers?
Was that FIPS?
By PS?
Let's see. I'm actually not familiar with that acronym, unfortunately.
Well, it's probably likely then that there isn't FIPS, data isn't being identified according to FIPS. I think it's a mechanism just for specifying the state, county, and place within the by census.
Yeah, so no, I guess we don't support that this time. I mean, we do have aggregated totals for counties and states. We're looking at other geographic regions that we could aggregate emissions to, like metro regions. But yeah, we don't have any FIPS codes or congressional districts or anything like that at this time.
Okay. Will there be any other relevant output data to correlate with the greenhouse gas emissions, such as in the power plant sector, the kilowatt hours generated or tons of steel produced in the steel industry and that type of thing?
A lot of that facility-specific information where we did collect it, like the amount of steel that someone's producing or the amount of cement the facility is producing, it is, even if we are collecting it, it's all marked as confidential business information. The EPA is not allowed to release exactly how much steel any individual facility was making. And we do understand that that would be useful information to folks because you could look at the efficiency of one plant and compare it to another. But unfortunately, we can't release that information at the facility level. But maybe over time, we're going to try to come up with creative ways to aggregate data so that we can at least do some benchmarks. Like maybe we could show the total emissions from all steel plants and the total production from all steel plants, then come up with an average amount of emissions per ton of steel generated across the country. So facilities could at least go in there and they could calculate their efficiency on their own and see how they compare to the national average and gauge their efficiencies that way.
And this might be a very similar response. Is there a way to search by owner name? Is that information that's included and can be publicly released?
Yeah, on that downloads page that I showed you that had the summary file, we do have a file that summarizes the corporate parents for each facility. Everyone that reports to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program had to list out all their U.S. corporate owners and the percentage ownership that each of those corporations has over the facility. So you can download that spreadsheet and figure out. You can't use it to complete like a complete corporate inventory because there's a lot of Scope 2 or Scope 3 emissions that wouldn't be accounted for in the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. But you can at least open that up and start getting a value for the direct emissions from different corporations.
And we have one final question, which is whether or not you have included the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, specifically from direct combustion of fuels in vehicles.
Yeah. On the second version of the data set that I showed you where there was the natural gas suppliers, we will also have a home for the petroleum product suppliers. And for each supplier of petroleum products, we will show the total greenhouse gas quantity associated with all the products they supplied. That portion of the data set we're actually still undergoing additional QA, QC, and we should be able to release it in late March or early April, but that's not quite available yet.
Well, we don't have any other questions. We do have a recommendation to the participants if they're interested in additional reading. Looks like an MIT technology review that includes the total world electricity generation. And they don't have much more information, but I assume that's a good source for other types of emissions reporting. So with that, since we don't have any additional questions, I'll hand it back to Julia and Andrea.
Thanks, Catherine. This is Julia. I just want to thank everyone again for joining us today, and I want to thank our speakers again. And we will be sending out information on upcoming webinars through our listservs and on our website. So thank you very much, and we hope to talk to you soon.